She carried 6 bags of groceries into that house, alone, 8 months pregnant. The driver was gone. Nobody told her. The elevator was too far, so she carried them herself, one slow step at a time, through the marble foyer of the most beautiful house she had ever lived in. And inside that house, behind a door open 2 inches, her mother-in-law was telling her husband exactly what to do with her after the baby came.
The trust is dissolved.
A lake condominium
This is
near
absurd.
the
He
water.
wouldn't do this to us.
Comfortable, quiet, out of the way. She stood in that hallway and she listened. And she did not cry. She did not scream. She walked to the kitchen, turned on the cold tap, held her wrists under the water, and counted. Because her grandmother had taught her that. Count to yourself, child, not to calm down, just to remember you are still here. What none of them knew. Not her husband, not his cold and calculating mother, not the woman already living in her guest cottage, redesigning her home, was something that had been true for 8 months and would change everything the moment it came to light. She did not live in that house. She owned it. Every room, every garden, every stone wall, every acre of ground they walked on like it belonged to them. $90 billion, and they had been treating her like the help. Stay with Cecilia today, because what she does next, quietly, patiently, without raising her voice once, is one of the most powerful things you will ever hear a woman do. Lesson statement. The women who are underestimated the longest are often the ones who were prepared the earliest. Silence is not weakness. Sometimes silence is the strategy, meaning plus value to the audience. This story is for every woman who has ever been made to feel like a guest in her own life. For every woman who kept running things, nobody thanked her for running. For every woman who was told, directly or indirectly, that her value was temporary, her role was functional, and her time was almost up. Cecilia's story is not just about property and wealth. It is about what happens when a woman finally decides to stand fully in what has always been hers. Her dignity, her worth, her ground. You will leave this story with something real, not just satisfaction, though there is plenty of that. You will leave with a reminder that being overlooked is not the same as being without power, and that the most solid things in life are often built in the quietest ways. If this story moved you, if you felt something in the first 60 seconds that made you want to stay, then Cecilia's journey is going to stay with you long after it ends. Do one small thing before you press play on the next chapter. Leave a comment below. It can be one word. It can be a sentence. Tell us where you are in your own story right now. We read every single one. And if you know someone who needs to hear that they are standing on solid ground, share this with them today. That one share might be exactly what they needed. If you are new here, welcome. Hit subscribe and stay a while. We tell stories about women who were underestimated. We tell them carefully and we tell them well. You are in the right place now. Back to Cecilia.
The heels clicked against the marble. Click, click, click. The sound traveled down the long hallway of Whitfield Estate, the way sound always traveled in old houses, cleanly, without apology. Cecilia heard the heels before she heard the voice. She had learned to track sounds in this house, the way you learn to track weather. You listened early, you prepared. She was standing in the main foyer with her grocery bags, both hands full. The drive had taken 40 minutes because the estate driver, Marcus, had not been available. Dorothea had given him the afternoon off without telling Cecilia. This happened sometimes. Cecilia had learned to keep the number of a car service saved in her phone. 8 months pregnant, 40 minutes in the back of a car service sedan. 6 bags of groceries because the kitchen inventory she had updated 3 days ago showed they were low on staples, and the regular delivery had been rescheduled without her knowledge. Again. She set the bags down carefully on the foyer bench. The marble floor was cold, even through her shoes. She pressed one hand to her lower back and breathed out slowly. That was when she heard the voice. It came from the east sitting room. The door was not fully closed. It was open perhaps 2 inches. 2 inches was enough in a house with marble floors and 14-foot ceilings. The voice belonged to Dorothea Whitfield. Cecilia did not move toward it. She stood exactly where she was, one hand on her lower back, and she listened. "You need to think seriously about what comes next, Preston." Dorothea's voice was the way it always was. Precise. Cool. Like a letter typed rather than written by hand. That woman has given you an heir. Fine. That was her function. But she has never fit here, and you know it. Cecilia's hand pressed harder against her back. She counted her heartbeats. 1, 2, 3. Preston's reply was quieter. She had to strain to catch it. "Mother, this isn't the time." "It is exactly the time." A pause. The sound of something being set down. A cup, maybe. Crystal on a side table. "Before that baby comes. Before things become legally complicated. Get her settled somewhere comfortable. There are lovely condominiums near the lake." Cecilia picked up her grocery bags. She did this slowly, deliberately, one bag at a time. She made no sound. She walked down the hallway, away from the east sitting room, through the butler's pantry, into the kitchen. The kitchen was enormous. 12-burner commercial range, walk-in pantry, a breakfast nook with a curved window seat that looked out over the private pond. Cecilia had reorganized this kitchen in her 3rd month at the estate. She had color-coded the pantry. She had replaced the inventory system with one that actually worked. She had memorized the preferences of every member of the household staff because it made the morning briefings faster. She set the bags on the counter. She turned on the cold tap. She held both wrists under the water. This was something her grandmother Greta had taught her when she was 9 years old and had come home from school shaking with fury about something a classmate had said. Greta had not asked what happened. She had simply turned on the kitchen tap and held Cecilia's small wrists under the cold water and said, "Count to yourself, child. Not to calm down, just to remember you are still here." Cecilia counted now. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. The water was very cold. Outside the kitchen window, the private pond was silver in the late afternoon light. 300 acres of grounds. The formal garden she had redesigned in her 5th month. The guest cottages along the west hedge. The stone walls that had been built in 1912 and had not needed replacing since. She turned off the tap. She dried her hands. She began unpacking the grocery bags. She moved through the kitchen the way she moved through everything in this house, efficiently, without drama. Canned tomatoes in the 3rd shelf of the pantry, left side, label facing out. Olive oil next to the range, fresh herbs in the small terracotta pots on the windowsill because the kitchen got good light on the east side, and fresh herbs kept longer here than in the refrigerator. She had learned all of this on her own. No one had shown her the kitchen systems. No one had introduced her to the staff properly. On her 2nd day at Whitfield Estate, Dorothea had handed her a list of household responsibilities, and said, pleasantly, "Preston tells me you are very organized." Cecilia had looked at the list. It covered 14 categories: kitchen management, staff scheduling, event coordination, vendor contracts, grounds oversight. She had said, "I'll need access to the household accounts." Dorothea had smiled. "Of course. I'll have our business manager set that up." The business manager had set it up 3 weeks later. In the meantime, Cecilia had introduced herself to every member of the staff individually and learned the systems by asking questions. That was 14 months ago. Now the staff called her directly. The vendors called her directly. The estate ran on her organizational labor the way a clock runs on its mainspring, quietly, invisibly, with no acknowledgement of the mechanism. She put the last of the groceries away. She stood in the center of the kitchen for a moment. The baby moved, a slow roll under her ribs, an elbow maybe, or a knee. She pressed her palm flat against the side of her belly and felt the movement settle. "I know," she said quietly. "I hear you." She went to the small desk in the corner of the kitchen. This desk was hers. She had claimed it in her second month, moving it slightly to catch the afternoon light. On it, a planner, a household ledger, a folder she had been quietly building for 6 weeks. The folder contained copies of invoices she had processed, email confirmations with her name as the authorizing signatory, vendor contracts that listed her contact information. She sat down. She opened her phone. She stared at the screen for a long moment. Then she dialed a number she had not called in 4 months. It rang twice. "Cecilia?" The voice was calm and measured, a man who chose his words the way a surgeon chose instruments. "I was wondering when you'd call." Fletcher Odom had been her grandmother Greta's attorney for 31 years. He had handled Cecilia's affairs since she was 19 and her parents had died, and there was suddenly a great deal to handle, and no one to help her do it, except Greta and Greta's quiet, steady lawyer. "Fletcher," she said, "tell me something." "Tell you what, specifically?" She looked out the kitchen window, the pond, the grounds, the stone walls built in 1912. "What exactly did my grandmother leave me?" A pause. Not a surprised pause. More like a pause of a man who has been waiting for a specific door to open and is now watching it open and choosing his next step carefully. "That's a conversation we should have in person," he said. "I can come tomorrow. Early, if that works." "It works," she said. "Cecilia." Another pause. Shorter this time. "Are you all right?" She looked at the grocery bags, folded neatly on the counter. 40 minutes in a car service sedan. 8 months pregnant. 6 bags carried in by herself. "I will be," she said. "Tomorrow. Early." She hung up. She sat at her desk, in the kitchen of the house she had come to love, the house she managed and organized and kept running, the house where a woman in the East sitting room had just described her as a function that had been fulfilled. She opened her planner. She began making a list. She did not sleep well. This was not new. The baby pressed against her ribs from the inside, and her mind pressed against everything from the inside, and together they made sleep a negotiation rather than a rest. By 4 in the morning, she was sitting in the chair by the east window of her private sitting room. This room was hers, truly hers, in the way that very few spaces in this house had felt. She had painted it herself in her 3rd month, a warm ivory that the afternoon light turned to something close to gold. She had found a lamp at an estate sale that cast the right quality of light. She had brought the needlepoint ottoman from her grandmother's house in Virginia. The one with the faded roses and the slightly short leg, the one Dorothea had looked at once and said pleasantly, "That clashes a bit, doesn't it?" Cecilia had kept it anyway. Now she sat in the chair with her feet on the ottoman and her hands folded over her belly, and she did something she had not allowed herself to do in 14 months. She let the evidence accumulate, not the recent evidence, not last night's open door and Dorothea's careful voice recommending lake condominiums. Further back, all the way back to the beginning. Month 2. The first Whitfield family dinner she had attended as Preston's wife. They had sat at the long dining table. 14 people. Preston's parents, his 2 sisters and their husbands, various cousins, and associates. Cecilia had worn the blue dress Preston had chosen because he said it was the right kind of dress for this family. She had sat next to Preston and smiled and answered questions. Dorothea had asked her about her background. Cecilia had said her grandmother had been in land and property management in Virginia. Dorothea had smiled. "How lovely," she had said. "Country roots." Then she had turned to speak to the person on her other side and had not addressed Cecilia again for the remainder of the meal. Month 3. Preston had called a meeting with the estate's household managers and introduced Cecilia as the person who would be overseeing day-to-day operations going forward. "She's very organized," he had said. The household managers had looked at her with the careful neutrality of people who had been with the Whitfield family for a long time and knew how to wait and see. Maureen, the head housekeeper, had given her a single direct nod, the kind that said something real. After the meeting, Maureen had found her in the hallway. "I'll show you the systems," Maureen had said simply, and she had, room by room, account by account, supplier by supplier. Maureen had shown her everything with the efficiency of someone passing a baton, and Cecilia had understood then that Maureen had been waiting for someone capable to arrive. What she had not understood then was why the capable person had to be invisible. Month 6. The Children's Hospital Charity Gala. Cecilia had spent 3 weeks coordinating every detail, the vendor contracts, the seating layout for 320 guests, the menu approvals, the audio and lighting specifications, the 40-person VIP list for the private reception before the main event. At the gala, Dorothea had introduced her to the hospital board chair. "This is Preston's wife," Dorothea had said. She helped a little with some of the arrangements. The board chair had shaken her hand and moved on. Cecilia had stood at the edge of the room in the navy blue dress Preston had chosen. She had held a glass of sparkling water. She had looked around the room she had built, event by event, detail by detail, and she had thought a thought she had immediately pushed down and locked away. "I built this evening. I negotiated every contract. I did not make a single mistake, and I am completely invisible." Month 9. She had found out she was pregnant. She had told Preston at dinner, quietly, just the 2 of them. He had been genuinely happy. She had seen it in him. That was the thing about Preston that made everything complicated. He was not a cruel man. He was a man who had learned to look away from inconvenient truths and had been doing it for so long that he had forgotten the looking away was a choice. He had told his mother the next morning. Dorothea had come to find Cecilia in the kitchen. "Congratulations," Dorothea had said. Her voice was warm in the surface way. The way marble is warm when the sun hits it just right. It does not go all the way through. "A baby is wonderful news. You'll want to take things easy now. Perhaps hand off some of the household management to someone with more capacity." Cecilia had looked at her. "I'm very healthy," she had said. "The doctor says I can continue normal activity through the 3rd trimester." Dorothea had smiled. "Of course. I just want to be helpful." She had not been helpful. What she had done over the following months was begin a slow and systematic reduction of Cecilia's visibility. Cecilia was still doing all the work, but she was increasingly not present at the meetings where the work was presented, not included in the dinners where the decisions were made, not consulted when changes were made to plans she had originated. And Cecilia, who was managing her pregnancy and her marriage and her grief for her grandmother, who had died 2 months after the pregnancy was confirmed, had let it happen. She had been too tired to fight it. She had told herself it was temporary. She had told herself Preston would notice and say something. He had not said anything. Now it was 4 a.m, and she was sitting in her chair, and the evidence was all around her, like furniture she had been stepping around for so long she had stopped seeing it. She said it out loud, not loudly, just clearly. The way you say a true thing when you are finally ready to say it. I was never going to be enough for them. Not because of anything I lacked, because they needed me to be less. The baby moved, that slow, certain movement. Cecilia pressed her hand to her belly. You are going to know, she told her daughter. Your whole life. You are going to know exactly who you are. She got up from the chair. She went to her desk. She opened the second drawer. Inside was the folder. Her personal folder. 6 weeks of quiet documentation. Copies of emails, invoice authorizations, vendor contacts, decisions she had made and implemented and never been credited for. She had started this folder without fully knowing why. Some part of her had known before the rest of her was ready to know. God, I knew. Some part of me knew for months. She opened her laptop. She went to the county property records website. She typed in the address of Whitfield Estate. She was not sure what she was looking for. She was running on 4 hours of sleep and 14 months of accumulated evidence and the quiet, certain knowledge that Fletcher Odom had said, I was wondering when you'd call, in the voice of a man who had been holding something in trust. The property records loaded. She read the screen. She read it again. The primary property owner of record for Whitfield Estate. All 340 acres, the main house, the guest cottages, the commercial parcels along the east boundary, was listed under a corporate entity. The corporate entity was named Hargrove Legacy Properties, LLC. Cecilia sat very still. The name Hargrove was her grandmother's name, her name. Outside the east window, the grounds were dark and still. The pond was invisible in the pre-dawn blackness. Somewhere out there, the formal garden was sleeping. The lavender she had planted in her 5th month dormant in the cool September air. She picked up her phone. She called Fletcher back. He answered immediately. It was 4:15 in the morning. He answered as though he had been awake. The property records, she said. Yes, he said. Explain. He did. Fletcher spoke for 11 minutes. Cecilia did not move during those 11 minutes. She sat at her desk with her feet on Greta's needlepoint ottoman, and she held the phone against her ear, and she listened to the story of her grandmother's life as she had never heard it told before. The version she had always known. Greta Hargrove was a woman of modest means who had been left a small parcel of land by her husband when he died young, and who had raised Cecilia's mother on very little, and who had lived in the same farmhouse in rural Virginia for 60 years, and who wore house dresses and kept her records in a fireproof box, and made the best biscuits Cecilia had ever tasted. The version Fletcher told, Greta Hargrove was one of the shrewdest real estate investors on the eastern seaboard who had spent 40 years quietly acquiring properties nobody else wanted, who had never once discussed her finances with anyone except her attorney, and who had built a portfolio worth, at current market valuation, just over $90 billion. $90 billion. Cecilia let the number sit in the air of her sitting room. It did not feel real. Numbers that large never felt real. They felt like something from a news broadcast, something that happened to institutions, not to women in house dresses who kept biscuit recipes and handwritten notebooks. But the details were real. Fletcher gave them carefully and precisely, because he was a careful and precise man. Greta had started with one lot, a half-acre industrial parcel outside Richmond that her husband had purchased before he died and that everyone told her was worthless. She had held it. She had waited. 12 years later, the city expanded, and the parcel was suddenly adjacent to a major commercial corridor. She had sold it for 30 times what her husband had paid. She had reinvested every dollar. She had done this again and again and again. Industrial parcels, defunct textile properties, warehouse lots on the edges of cities that were growing in directions people had not yet noticed. She had noticed. She had never been flashy about it. She had never bought anything visible, nothing that would generate conversation. She had been invisible by design. She had understood, very early, that a woman in rural Virginia who became publicly wealthy in the 1970s would face a specific set of problems that a woman who remained apparently modest would not. So she had remained apparently modest. She had worn her house dresses. She had maintained her farmhouse. She had driven her old truck and grown her lavender and raised her daughter and then her granddaughter, and she had, in complete silence, built an empire. By the time Cecilia was 10 years old, Greta's portfolio had grown beyond anything that could be described as comfortable wealth. It was significant wealth, generational wealth, the kind that changed the trajectory of everyone who touched it. She had not told Cecilia. She had not told anyone. Why didn't she tell me? Cecilia asked. Fletcher was quiet for a moment. She told me once, he said. She said that people who know they are wealthy spend their whole lives managing other people's reactions to their wealth. She said she wanted you to know who you were before you knew what you had. Cecilia closed her eyes. She thought of Greta at the kitchen table in the farmhouse, the fireproof box under the counter, the house dresses, the lavender in the yard. The way Greta had looked at her, sometimes, across the dinner table, with an expression Cecilia had always read as love, and now was reading as something more, something deliberate. Like a teacher watching a student work through a problem they already know the answer to, waiting patiently for the moment of arrival. Whitfield Estate, Cecilia said. Yes, Fletcher said. 14 years ago, the Whitfield family had faced a significant financial crisis. Cecilia had not known this. Preston had certainly not told her. The estate, built in 1912, maintained at enormous expense for 3 generations, had become financially untenable. The family had needed liquidity. They had needed it quietly, because the Whitfields did not publicize difficulty. A blind trust had approached them. The trust had offered to purchase the estate outright at fair market value, with the family retaining a long-term residential lease at below market rate. The arrangement preserved the family's ability to live in their ancestral home while solving their immediate financial crisis. The blind trust was Hargrove Legacy Properties, LLC. The Whitfield family had signed the papers. They had moved back into their home as tenants. They had been paying rent, subsidized, below market rent, to Cecilia's grandmother for 14 years. And they had not known, because the trust was blind, because the corporate entity had no visible connection to a woman in a house dress in rural Virginia. Because nobody had asked, because the Whitfields had been too proud and too relieved to look too closely at the mechanism of their own rescue. When did I inherit? Celia asked. Your grandmother passed 8 months ago, Fletcher said. The estate transferred to you immediately upon her death, as per the trust documents. You have been the legal majority owner of Whitfield Estate since then. 8 months. She had been managing this house, running its operations, coordinating its staff, maintaining its accounts, for 8 months as its legal owner, and she had not known. Because she had not called Fletcher, because she had been pregnant and grieving and managing, and she had told herself she would deal with the paperwork eventually. God, Grandma, you absolute force of nature. She set down the phone after the call ended. She sat in the chair for a long time. Outside the window, the sky was beginning to lighten, the first gray suggestion of morning. The pond would be visible soon. The grounds, the garden. She thought about every conversation she'd ever had with Greta. She was replaying them now with different information, and they were all changing shape. All the things Greta had said that seemed like simple country wisdom were reformatting themselves into something more deliberate, more prepared. The last time they had spoken properly, 2 weeks before Greta died, Greta had taken Cecilia's hand across the kitchen table and looked at her with those steady dark eyes and said, "You're going to be fine, child. Better than fine." Cecilia had thought she was talking about the pregnancy. She had not been talking about the pregnancy. She got up from her chair. She walked through her sitting room and out into the hallway. She took the back stairs, down through the quiet house, through the kitchen, and out the rear door. The morning air hit her like cold water. September at its last soft edge, before fall arrived properly. She walked across the rear terrace and through the gate in the low stone wall that separated the formal grounds from the private garden. She had designed this garden herself in her 5th month. She had worked alongside the groundskeeper, a quiet man named Ray, who had been at the estate for 22 years, and who had watched her measure and plan and adjust with what she'd understood at the time as polite patience and now suspected might have been recognition. The garden had lavender, rosemary, a climbing rose along the east wall that she had chosen specifically because Greta had grown the same variety in her yard in Virginia. She sat on the stone bench at the center. She did not cry. She was not at the crying stage yet. She breathed in the lavender. She put both hands on her belly. The baby was still, finally sleeping the way babies did in the early morning hours. She sat in her garden, in the garden of her house, and she thought about what it meant that she had been brought here as a wife and managed the place as labor and been treated as a temporary inconvenience. And the whole time the ground under everyone's feet had belonged to her. Solid ground, Greta had said. Just know, child, that you will always be standing on solid ground. She had thought it was a metaphor. Morning arrived with the sound of the kitchen coming alive. Cecilia could hear it from her sitting room, the coffee grinder, the sound of the refrigerator door. Maureen, who arrived at 6:30 every morning with the reliability of a tide, moving through the kitchen with the efficient quiet of someone who had been doing this for a long time. Cecilia had slept 3 hours. She was used to this. The baby in her mind had been conspiring against sleep for weeks. She dressed carefully. She did not rush. She came downstairs at 7 and made herself a bowl of oatmeal because Dr. Crane had told her protein and complex carbohydrates in the morning were not optional at 36 weeks. She stood at the counter to eat it because sitting at the large dining table alone felt like something she was no longer willing to perform. Maureen was refolding the linen napkins at the sideboard. This was a thing Maureen Amois did when she had something on her mind. She refolded things she had already folded perfectly. It was her tell. Cecilia watched her for a moment. "Maureen," she said. "Mrs. Whitfield." "What is it?" Maureen set down the napkin she was holding. She looked at the sideboard, not at Cecilia, and she said, in a voice that was entirely neutral, "The West Guest Cottage. Someone has been staying there. I assumed you had authorized it." Cecilia set down her spoon. "I didn't." Maureen nodded once. She picked up the napkin again. She refolded it. "I see," she said, and that was all she said. Cecilia finished her oatmeal. She rinsed her bowl. She put on her wool cardigan. The warm gray one she had bought for herself in her second month, before she had understood that Dorothea found it insufficiently elegant for an estate of this standing. She wore it anyway now, every day. She walked to the West Guest cottage. The cottage was 300 yards from the main house, screened by a yew hedge and a stand of old oaks that had been there since the estate was built. It was a lovely cottage, 2 bedrooms, its own sitting room and kitchen, a terrace that overlooked the pond. Cecilia had furnished it herself when she first arrived at the estate, choosing pieces that were comfortable and well made without being ostentatious, because that was how she thought a guest should feel. Welcome, not overwhelmed. She tried the door. It was unlocked. Inside, the cottage had been changed. The curtain she had chosen, ivory linen, simple and clean, had been replaced with something silkier, blush-colored, expensive. On the hall table was a woman's handbag, dark leather, the kind that cost more than most people's rent. A pair of heels near the door. The bathroom counter held a collection of toiletries that were not the estate's standard stock. On the desk, in the small study, a laptop was open to a project management interface. The project was titled Whitfield Estate Renovation, Phase 1. Cecilia walked to the desk. She opened the folder beside the laptop. Inside was a complete architectural proposal, new layouts for the ground floor library and east sitting room, a full redesign of the master suite, notes about relocating the nursery to the far east wing. The proposals were detailed and professional and had the name A. Burrow, Design Director, on every page header. At the bottom of the cover sheet was a signature, P. Whitfield, her husband's signature, approving a renovation of the estate, a renovation she had not been consulted on, a renovation of her home planned by a woman who was living in her cottage. Cecilia stood at the desk for a moment. Then she took out her phone. She photographed every page of the proposal, methodically, one by one. When she was done, she replaced the folder exactly as she had found it. She walked out of this cottage and closed the door behind her. She stood on the small stone path outside and breathed in the morning air. The anger was not loud. It was not hot. It was the kind of anger that arrives when the last piece of evidence falls into place and the full picture becomes suddenly, undeniably clear. Cold, crystalline, architectural. He signed renovation plans on a property he does not own for a woman living in my cottage without asking me. She called Bridget. Bridget Calloway answered before the second ring. She always did when Cecilia called before 8 in the morning. "Talk to me," Bridget said. "I need you to come," Cecilia said. "Today, if you can." A pause. Then, "How bad?" "There's a woman living in my guest cottage who is redesigning my home." Silence for 3 seconds. "I'm packing a bag," Bridget said. "Do you want me to bring wine?" "I need a clear head," Cecilia said. "I'm bringing both, then. One's for me." Cecilia almost smiled. She walked back toward the main house with her hands in the pockets of her gray cardigan, and her mind moving in the particular way it moved when she was working through a problem. Organized, sequential, clear. Bridget arrived at 2 in the afternoon in a rental car with a rolling suitcase and an expression that said she had been preparing for this call for longer than Cecilia had been making it. She stood in the foyer of Whitfield Estate and looked around with the frank, assessing gaze of a contracts attorney cataloging a room. "Bigger than I expected," she said. "Come upstairs," Cecilia said. In Cecilia's sitting room, she spread everything out. The photographs of the renovation documents, her printed copy of the county property records, the notes she had written during her call with Fletcher, the folder she had been building for 6 weeks. Bridget read through everything with the rapid, total focus of someone who spent her professional life processing complex information quickly. She did not interrupt. She did not comment. She read. When she finished, she set down the last page and looked at Cecilia. "Honey," she said, "I have been biting my tongue for 14 months. "I know," Cecilia said. "They have genuinely no idea." Bridget shook her head slowly. The renovation plans, Cece. He signed plans for a house he doesn't own. I know. When do you want to tell them? Cecilia looked out the east window, the grounds below, the garden, the west hedge, where the cottage sat behind its screen of oaks. She put her hand on her belly. "After she's born," she said. "I am not doing this while I'm pregnant. I want to be standing on both feet." Bridget nodded. "Then we prepare." "Yes," Cecilia said. "We prepare." Fletcher Odom arrived the next morning at 9 o'clock with a briefcase and the expression of a man who had been waiting a long time for a meeting that was now finally happening. Cecilia had taken over the dining room. She had done this deliberately, moving her planning materials to the long mahogany table that was the center of every formal Whitfield family gathering, spreading her documents across the surface that Dorothea used to host the dinners where Cecilia was introduced as Preston's wife, with a pause before the title. Fletcher opened his briefcase and arranged his documents with care. Bridget sat across from him with a yellow legal pad in the role of personal support that also happened to come with 6 years of litigation experience. "All right," Cecilia said. "The full picture." Fletcher gave it. He had been holding the full picture in trust since Greta died, waiting for Cecilia to be ready to receive it. He had tried to reach her in the months after the death. She had been too deep in grief and pregnancy and the daily management of a household that demanded everything she had. She had asked him to wait. He had waited. The portfolio Cecilia had inherited through Hargrove Legacy Properties, LLC, covered properties in Virginia, Maryland, and West Virginia. At current market valuation, the total worth was just over $90 billion. This included Whitfield Estate, all 340 acres, with every building on it. The documents Preston had asked Cecilia to sign in her first month at the estate, the ones his family's attorney had presented as standard household management transfers, were exactly what he had told her they were. They transferred operational responsibility. They had no effect on legal ownership. In terms of property law, they meant approximately nothing. So he had her sign paperwork she didn't need to sign, Bridget said, in a house she already owned. "Correct," Fletcher said. "And the renovation plans she photographed would require written authorization from the legal owner of the property," Fletcher said, "which Preston Whitfield is not. And the residential lease the Whitfield family has been operating under since they sold the estate 14 years ago." Fletcher allowed himself the smallest pause before his next sentence. "Comes up for renewal in 63 days. The dining room was very quiet. Then Cecilia said, "Good." Bridget looked at her, a long look, the look of a woman who has known another woman since they were 18 years old and knows exactly what a particular expression on that face means. "Cece," she said. "I know," Cecilia said. "I'm not going to blow anything up. I'm going to do this correctly." "What does correctly look like?" Cecilia put both palms flat on the mahogany table. She could feel the grain under her hands, antique wood, brought from England in the 1940s. She had polished this table herself twice since she moved in because the household was using the wrong product and she could see the finish dulling. "It looks like 63 days of preparation," she said, and then a conversation. That evening, Dorothea hosted a dinner. She had informed Maureen, who had informed Cecilia with the careful neutrality that characterized all of Maureen's communications about things Cecilia had not been consulted on. 4 guests: Warren Whitfield, a business associate named Clive and his wife, a pleasant woman named Pamela, who collected vintage maps and was the most genuine person at the table, and Annalise Burrow. Annalise was introduced as the design consultant Preston had brought in for estate updates. She was 29 and polished in the particular way of someone who had studied what polish looked like and reproduced it carefully. She wore red. She sat in the chair that was, by household seating tradition, Cecilia's chair, the one closest to the kitchen passage, which Cecilia used because it was easier to move in and out with a pregnancy. Dorothea said, "Annalise has brought such fresh vision to the estate renovation project. Sometimes you need new eyes." Pamela, the business associate's wife, turned to Cecilia with genuine warmth. "Did you work with her on the design ideas? I imagine you know this house so well." Before Cecilia could answer, Dorothea said, "Cecilia handles more of the domestic side, menus, that sort of thing." Pamela nodded and turned back to Annalise. Cecilia picked up her fork. She ate. She said very little. Beside her, Bridget, introduced as her visiting college friend, did the same. Their eyes met exactly once across the table. Bridget gave the smallest possible shake of her head. Not yet. After dinner, Cecilia took the east hallway route back to her sitting room. She took this route every evening because the floors on the east side of the house were warmer. Her feet swelled badly by evening, and warm floors helped. This route passed the small alcove near the library. She heard voices from the alcove. She stopped. Preston's voice. And a woman's voice, lower, more deliberate. They were not conspiring about anything dramatic. What they were doing was, in some ways, worse. They were talking about the estate, casually, as though it had already been decided. Annalise was describing the reconfiguration of the master suite. Preston was asking about the nursery placement. They sounded like two people planning something they considered entirely within their rights to plan. "Will she be difficult about it?" Annalise asked. A pause. "She doesn't really have grounds to be," Preston said. Cecilia stood in the hallway for 5 seconds. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. She walked to her sitting room. She closed the door. She sat in her chair. She put her hands on her belly. "He doesn't think I have grounds." She looked at the needlepoint ottoman. Greta's hands had made that pattern. In the evenings, while watching television, patient and methodical, stitch by stitch, the same way she had built everything, one small thing at a time, over a long time, until the small things had accumulated into something no one had thought to look closely at. She did not have grounds. She had the deed. She opened her phone. She texted Fletcher, "I am ready to move on the lease renewal timeline." His response came 30 seconds later. "I'll begin the filing process Monday." She put the phone down. She breathed. The baby was very still. The validation arrived not from outside, but from inside, the way the real validations always do. She said it quietly to the room. "I deserved better than this, and so does she." She meant the baby. She meant herself. She meant perhaps the whole long line of women who had been underestimated by people standing on their foundations. 3 weeks passed. The estate continued around Cecilia the way water continues around a stone. Annalise had begun joining the family for breakfast 3 days out of 5. Preston was home late on most evenings. Dorothea had taken to referencing the renovation project in the present tense, as though it were already underway. Cecilia managed the household. She attended to the accounts. She scheduled the staff. She went to her appointments with Dr. Crane, who was warm and direct, and told her the baby was positioned well, and her blood pressure was good, and to rest when she could. She rested when she could. She also, in the hours that were hers, continued preparing. With Fletcher. With Bridget by phone in the evenings. She reviewed every document in the estate's operational history. She signed what needed signing. She confirmed what needed confirming. She was methodical and quiet and thorough the way Greta had taught her to be, the way you had to be when the thing you were building was meant to last. But the body does not always cooperate with strategy. It was a Tuesday afternoon. The house was quiet, in the particular way it got quiet when Dorothea was at her luncheon, and Preston was in the city, and Annalise had taken the estate car to the design district without asking Cecilia, because the estate car was managed by the household manager, and she had simply called and asked, and the household manager, not knowing what he did not know, had said yes. Cecilia was in her sitting room. She was sitting in her chair. She had been going through correspondence. She had been doing what she always did. And then without any particular warning, she stopped. She sat. She put the correspondence down. She let the weight of it settle on her, all of it at once. 14 months of invisible management, the grief for Greta that she had not fully processed because there had been no space to process it. Always something to manage. Always some next thing. The loneliness of being in a house full of people and seen by none of them. The specific fear of giving birth in a few weeks' time to a daughter who would be born into this, into all of this. And Cecilia needed to have fixed it by then. She pressed her hands over her face. She did not make a sound. She sat in her chair, in her sitting room, and she pressed her hands over her face, and she shook, once, like a person releasing something they had been holding for too long. And then she breathed. And then she was still. When she took her hands from her face, she noticed, as she often noticed in difficult moments, the needlepoint ottoman, Greta's hands. She got up. She moved slowly now, 36 weeks along, her body weighted and deliberate. She went to the window seat on the east side of the sitting room. This was her spot. She had made it her spot in her 3rd month, installed a cushion, arranged the light. On the window seat was a small wooden box from Greta's house. Inside the box, a photograph of Greta at 40, standing in a field in Virginia with a look on her face that Cecilia had always described to herself as determined. A pressed flower, lavender, from Greta's garden. A small card in Greta's handwriting. She opened the card. She had read it many times. Cecilia, you have always been worth more than people assumed. That was their blindness, not your deficit. When you need reminding, you're standing on solid ground. All of it. I made sure. She read it 3 times. Then she set it back in the box. She said it aloud to the room, not loudly, just clearly, the way she said true things. I am not a guest here. I never was. They brought me into my own house and charged me rent and dignity. That is over. She picked up her phone. She called Bridget. I'm ready, she said. Already? Bridget said. You said after she's born. I changed my mind, Cecilia said. I want her to be born into something that's already been set right. A pause. Then Bridget said, quietly, tell me what you need. The next morning, Annalise presented her renovation proposal at a breakfast meeting she had organized with Preston and Dorothea. Cecilia had not been invited. She had learned about it from Maureen, who had mentioned the meeting time when discussing the morning coffee service, because Maureen had a way of mentioning things. Cecilia walked into the breakfast room at the meeting's midpoint. She had timed this deliberately. She wanted to arrive when the proposal was visible, but before the discussion had concluded. Annalise's presentation boards were arranged along the table. Cecilia looked at them the way she had looked at the renovation documents in the cottage. Carefully, completely. The proposal included removal of Cecilia's private sitting room to expand the master suite, relocation of the nursery to the far east wing, a room that was cold in winter and got no morning light, conversion of the rear garden, her garden, the lavender garden, the climbing rose against the east wall, into an outdoor entertaining terrace with a concrete surface. Dorothea was saying, The garden has always been underutilized. Cecilia sat down. She poured herself a glass of water from the pitcher on the table. She looked at the presentation boards. She said pleasantly, "These are beautiful renderings." Annalise blinked. She had expected absence or objection. Pleasantness was not in her preparation. "Thank you," she said, carefully. "Before any renovation work begins," Cecilia said, in the same pleasant voice, "the estate will need written authorization from the legal owner of the property. Is that in the proposal documentation?" A silence settled over the breakfast table. Preston said, "I approved it." "Yes," Cecilia said gently. "I saw your signature. I just want to make sure we have the correct owner's authorization for the legal record." She let it sit. Nobody asked what she meant. Nobody was quite certain enough to ask. She finished her water. She thanked Annalise for the presentation. She went to her garden. She stood among the lavender and the climbing rose, and she breathed the morning air, and she thought, "The table is set. Now we wait for the right moment to sit down." Fletcher filed the lease renewal notification on a Wednesday morning. The notification was sent by certified mail to the Whitfield family's residential attorney of record, a man named Garfield Pruitt, who had served the family for 25 years. The notification was on Hargrove Legacy Properties, LLC letterhead, which the Whitfield family had never examined closely because the name on the checks matched the name on the account, and that had always been sufficient. The notification informed the current tenants of Whitfield Estate that the existing residential lease would expire in 60 days and that renewal terms were under revision. It requested a meeting with authorized legal representatives of both parties to discuss the new terms. It was a standard legal document, entirely routine, the sort of thing that happened in commercial and residential property management every day. It arrived on Dorothea Whitfield's desk on a Thursday afternoon. She handled all formal household correspondence. She had done so for 30 years, since the estate passed to her and Warren to manage. Cecilia was in the kitchen with Maureen when she heard it. Not the letter being opened, not the reading. What she heard was Dorothea's voice from the direction of the private sitting room in a register she had never heard before. Not the cool, controlled precision. Something rawer, higher. Something that had been surprised out of its composure. Cecilia kept making tea. Preston appeared in the kitchen doorway 20 minutes later. He was wearing the expression he wore when something had happened that he was not yet sure how to manage. His face did this thing when he was recalculating. She had noticed it in the first month of their relationship. It had seemed endearing then. Now it was simply a signal. "Cece," he said, "can we talk?" "Of course," she said. "There's a letter from the estate management company." He paused. "There seems to be some administrative situation with the property, with the lease." "Oh?" "The management company is... Apparently, there's an ownership structure that we weren't fully aware of." He was choosing his words very carefully. "Our attorneys are looking into it." "What kind of ownership structure?" "The company is called Hargrove Legacy Properties." He said the name like it was a question. "Do you know anything about that?" Hargrove. Her grandmother's name. Her name. He was saying it to her face, and he did not see it. She said, "I'll need to speak with Fletcher. He would know better than I would about my family's business affairs." She picked up her tea. She walked out of the kitchen. In the hallway, she paused at the tall gilt mirror by the east entrance, original to the house, 6 feet tall, gilt frame, the kind of mirror that had watched many versions of this family come and go. She looked at herself, 8 months pregnant, gray wool cardigan, pearl earrings, small ones, that had been Greta's. Her face entirely calm. "I look like someone's wife. I look like someone who helps with the menus. Good. Let them keep not seeing me. The paperwork doesn't care what they see. She walked to her sitting room. She called Fletcher. It arrived, she said. Yes, he said. Garfield Pruitt called my office this morning. How did he sound? A pause. Then, with the restraint of a man who had been a lawyer for 30 years, concerned. Good, she said. The following afternoon, Garfield Pruitt arrived at the estate. He met with Dorothea and Preston and Warren in the study. He had, clearly, spent the preceding 24 hours doing research. He had not researched enough. Or he had researched the right things and found the wrong answers, which was more disturbing. He came out of the study at 4:15. He saw Cecilia sitting in the formal living room. She was in the chair by the east window, the one with the best sight line to the study door. She was reading, or appearing to read. Garfield Pruitt stopped. He looked at her for a moment with the expression of a man who was rearranging his understanding of a situation in real time. Mrs. Whitfield, he said carefully, may I ask, are you in contact with the legal representation for Hargrove Legacy Properties? Fletcher Odom is my personal attorney, she said. He's handled my family's affairs since I was a child. Garfield looked at her for 3 long seconds. I see, he said. He went back into the study. Cecilia listened. The voices started low. Then Dorothea's voice rose first, not to shouting, because Dorothea did not shout, but to a register that was, for Dorothea, the equivalent of shouting, sharp, strained, the sound of a woman who had been certain of a particular reality for a very long time, discovering that the reality was built on something she had not examined. Then Preston's voice, controlled at first, then not. What do you mean she owns it? Cecilia turned a page of her book. She was not reading the words, but she kept her eyes on the page because that was the right thing to do in this moment. Not smug, not satisfied, just present, just here, in her house, in her chair, on her solid ground. That evening, Bridget called. I heard something moved today, she said. A few things, Cecilia said. How are you feeling? Cecilia was sitting in her garden. The lavender was cool and soft around her. The climbing rose on the east wall had a late bloom, stubborn in the September chill. The petals pale pink in the fading light. Very well, she said. And she meant it completely. She said it to the garden, to Greta, who was everywhere in it. I did not survive everything that has happened in this house to be moved to a lake condominium. I am the foundation here, literally. She breathed in the lavender. She was home. The 63 days did not take 63 days. They took 11 because once the certified letter had arrived and Garfield Pruitt had done his research and the Whitfield family understood what they were looking at, the pace of events accelerated with the logic of dominoes. One tile fell, and the others followed in sequence. Preston called a family meeting for a Saturday morning. He and Dorothea and Warren sat on one side of the dining room table. Garfield Pruitt sat at the end. Fletcher Odom sat beside Cecilia. Bridget sat next to Cecilia on her other side, with her yellow legal pad open on the table in front of her. The dining room had never been quiet in quite this way. The antique mahogany table reflected the morning light from the tall windows. The silver candlesticks were polished. Everything in this room was polished. Cecilia had overseen the polishing. Fletcher presented the situation the way Fletcher presented all situations, clearly, without drama, with the precision that made him very good at his job, Greta Hargrove's estate. The blind trust, the 14-year-old purchase, the residential lease, the inheritance, the transfer of ownership to Cecilia 8 months ago upon Greta's death, the documents Preston had asked Cecilia to sign in her first month at the estate, operational management transfers with no legal effect on property ownership. The portfolio, $90 billion in assets across 3 states, with Whitfield Estate as one of the primary holdings. The lease renewal, 60 days to negotiate new terms or vacate the premises. Dorothea was very still when Fletcher finished. The stillness of someone who has reassembled their composure so rapidly and so completely that you can almost see the seams. Almost. My daughter-in-law, she said, in a voice that was perfectly level, has owned this estate for 8 months. Correct, Fletcher said. The management transfers she signed when she moved in were operationally meaningless in terms of property rights, Fletcher said. They transferred scheduling responsibility, nothing more. Dorothea turned to look at Preston. Cecilia had never seen Dorothea look at her son quite this way. The look contained something that was not, for once, directed outward. It was contained between them, private and damning. You told me the Hargrove girl had nothing, Dorothea said. I didn't know, Preston began. You presented her to this family as a woman of modest background. Mother! You didn't ask, Dorothea said. The sentence landed and stayed. Preston said nothing, because there was nothing to say that was not, in some sense, true. He had not asked. He had been pleased with the narrative he had constructed. A woman of simple origins, who was grateful and capable and would fit neatly into the household role he had mentally assigned her. He had not asked because the narrative was comfortable, and asking might have disrupted it. Warren Whitfield had been silent for the entire meeting. He was 66 and tired and had the face of a man who had been managing consequences for decades and was very weary of it. Now he looked at Cecilia across the table. Your grandmother was Greta Hargrove, he said. Yes, she said. I read about her portfolio in a property journal years ago, before Preston brought you home. He paused. I didn't make the connection. He did not apologize. He might never apologize in words, but this was the most honest statement anyone in this family had made to her in 14 months. She recognized it for what it was. She nodded once. That afternoon, Cecilia walked to the West guest cottage. She knocked this time. Annalise opened the door. She was wearing plain clothes. Her hair was down. Without the careful performance of the dinner table, she looked younger. She looked at Cecilia with an expression that had several things moving through it simultaneously, and not all of them were what Cecilia expected. I should start packing, Annalise said. The cottage lease concludes at end of month, Cecilia said. 3 weeks. A pause. I didn't know about the ownership structure, Annalise said. I know. I'm not sure I can claim the same ignorance about the rest of it. No, Cecilia agreed. But that's between you and your own conscience. She turned to go. Then Annalise said, quietly, the renovation plans. I want you to know. The garden? I didn't include it in the changes. I could see the care in it. Cecilia stood still for a moment with her back to the cottage door. Good eye, she said. She walked back through the morning toward the main house. 2 days later, Bridget called her at 8 in the morning. Annalise Burrow called my number, she said. Found it in the estate contact list. I know, Cecilia said. She texted me first to ask if she could. And you said? I said yes. Annalise came the following afternoon with a folder of her own, not renovation plans this time. Inside, text messages between herself and Preston, financial records, written commitments he had made to her, via text, via email, in documented conversations, regarding the estate renovation project, guarantees he had provided using a property he had no authority to guarantee. She set the folder on the dining room table. She sat across from Cecilia and Bridget, and she was clearly not comfortable with what she was doing, but she was doing it. I'm not doing this out of altruism, she said. He misrepresented the situation to me as well. I built 6 months of professional work on a foundation he told me was solid. It wasn't solid. And I think you should have this. Bridget looked at the folder. She looked at Cecilia. She looked at Annalise. Material witness, Bridget said. That's how I'd characterize it, Annalise said. She almost smiled. After Annalise left, Cecilia sat at the dining room table for a moment. She thought about the categories of betrayal in the past year. Which ones were intentional? Which were lazy? Which were the result of people simply never having been required to look closely at the person standing in front of them? She said it quietly, to herself, to Bridget. I'm not angry at the right people anymore. I was angry at everyone. Now I can see exactly where each thing began and ended. Bridget looked at her. That's a relief. Yes, Cecilia said. It is. That evening, for the first time in weeks, she slept through until 5 in the morning. 41 days before the lease expiration, Fletcher filed the formal lease restructuring offer with the Whitfield family's attorneys. The terms were straightforward. A new 10-year residential lease at current market rate for a property of this size and character in this location. Standard occupancy conditions. No management rights granted to the leaseholders. No authority to authorize renovations without written owner consent. No subletting of any cottage or outbuilding without written owner approval. Market rate for Whitfield Estate, as assessed by 3 independent appraisers, was significant. The current lease rate, negotiated by Greta's Trust 14 years ago as part of the rescue arrangement, had been running at 40% below market. The Whitfields had been living, for 14 years, on a subsidy from a woman they had never met and would never have believed had she walked into their dining room. Preston requested a negotiation meeting. Cecilia agreed. She scheduled it for a Thursday. On the Wednesday night before the meeting, her water broke. She was in her sitting room. It was 11:30 at night. She was reading because sleep had become more ambitious than achievable at 37 weeks. She had been expecting this. Dr. Crane had told her at her last appointment that the baby was fully engaged and ready, and it would happen when it happened. It happened. She was very calm. She had been calm about the birth in a way that surprised her, given how uncalm she had felt about many other things in the past months. But the birth felt manageable, concrete. Her body knew what to do. She trusted her body. She called Dr. Crane. She called Bridget. She called Fletcher because she needed him to know the meeting would need to be rescheduled. She looked at her phone for a moment before calling anyone else. Then she called Preston. He answered on the 3rd ring, groggy, confused. Cece? The baby is coming, she said. I'm going to the hospital. I need you to know. He was there within 35 minutes. She was already in the car when he arrived. Bridget at the wheel. He followed in his own car. Cecilia sat in the back seat and breathed through the contractions and thought, in the spaces between contractions, about the meeting that would happen after, about the documents, about the new lease, about what the next chapter of this house would look like when it had been built on something honest. The hospital corridors were clean and bright. Dr. Crane was there within the hour. Bridget stayed in the room. Preston sat in the waiting area. Cecilia did not ask him to come in. She did not ask him to stay away. She was focused on something much more important than any of the complicated things between them. At 4:17 in the morning, on a Thursday, Cecilia's daughter arrived. 7 pounds and 4 ounces. Loud immediately. Decisive about her presence in the world. She had Greta's jaw. Squared, determined, and Cecilia's eyes, dark and wide and very serious about everything they looked at. Bridget cried. Bridget, who prided herself on strategic composure in all circumstances, cried without embarrassment and blew her nose on a hospital tissue and said, "She's perfect. She's absolutely perfect. Yes, Cecilia said. She held her daughter in the quiet of the recovery room. The hospital was dim and still at this hour. Outside the window, the sky was beginning to lighten at the edges. Your great-grandmother built you a house, she said to her daughter. I'm going to make sure you know your whole life that you are standing on solid ground. She named her Greta Hargrove Whitfield. They came home 4 days later. The estate was quiet in the particular way it got quiet when something significant had shifted in its atmosphere. Maureen had put fresh flowers in the foyer. She had done this without being asked. Cecilia noticed. The negotiation meeting was rescheduled for the following Monday. Cecilia met Preston in the formal sitting room 6 days after the birth, with Fletcher and Bridget present. She was sitting in her chair, the specific chair that was hers, in the room that was hers, in the house that was hers. Baby Greta was in the bassinet that Cecilia had moved to the sitting room because she was not yet ready to be in a different room from her daughter, and also because she thought it was useful for everyone present to be reminded of what was at stake. Preston came in, looking like a man who had been doing a great deal of thinking and had arrived at a specific kind of humility. He sat down. He looked at the baby. He looked at the bassinet and at the sleeping face of his daughter, and something moved through his expression that was complicated and real. He tried several approaches. He began with the marriage, the appeal to what they were supposed to be building together. Baal Detter. Then he moved to an argument about disclosure, that she should have told him what she had inherited. Then he arrived at something that had more sincerity in it, something that Cecilia could see cost him to say. I failed you, he said. I was comfortable, and I didn't ask questions, and I let things happen that I should have prevented. She listened to this. She gave it the weight it deserved, which was real weight, because it was a real admission from a man who had spent most of his adult life avoiding admissions. Preston, she said, I didn't know the full extent of what I had inherited until 8 months ago. That's true, but in those 8 months, you moved another woman into this house. You approved renovation plans you had no authority to approve. You sat at my grandmother's table and watched your mother tell a room full of people that my function here was to produce an heir. I don't need you to have done it maliciously. I need you to understand that it happened. He nodded. He looked at the table. I didn't ask enough questions. No, she said. You didn't. Fletcher slid the lease documentation across the table. Preston's attorney had reviewed it already. He knew what it said. Market rate, standard terms, no management rights, written owner consent required for all renovations, 10-year term, renewable. You want us to stay? Preston asked. He sounded genuinely uncertain, as though this was not an outcome he had prepared for. I want the estate to function as an estate, Cecilia said. Your family built it. My grandmother purchased it. Our daughter will inherit it. What happens between now and then is a conversation we can have as adults, if we choose to. He reviewed the documents for a long time. Then he signed them. Not the old lease, the new one, the honest one. Cecilia watched him sign. She thought about Greta, who had purchased this house 14 years ago and had never once set foot in it, who had never met the family that lived in it, who had simply held it in trust, the way she held everything, patiently and carefully and without announcing herself until the right person was ready to step into it. That right person had always been Cecilia. Greta had known. Dorothea came to the sitting room the following morning. She came alone, without announcement, in the early light before the rest of the house was awake. Cecilia was nursing the baby. She did not get up. Dorothea stood in the doorway for a moment, looking at Cecilia, and then at the baby, and then back at Cecilia. Her face was the most undefended Cecilia had ever seen it. The composure was there, the posture was there, the precise way she held herself that was muscle memory from 64 years of being a Whitfield. But something underneath it had shifted. "Your grandmother," she said finally. "Was she formidable?" "Exceptionally," Cecilia said. Dorothea looked at baby Greta, sleeping in the crook of Cecilia's arm, at the squared jaw and the wide dark eyes and the utter certainty of the small face. "I see," Dorothea said quietly. She did not apologize. She might never apologize in words, but she closed the sitting room door when she left, gently, without the controlled punctuation of power she usually gave to closed doors, just a door closing softly. It was not everything. It was something. The autumn deepened. The estate settled into a new register of itself, not dramatically, not all at once, the way a house settles after a storm, gradually, quietly, each room finding its new arrangement of air and light. Maureen stayed. She had never considered leaving. She had simply, for 14 months, been waiting for the household to be run by the right person, officially rather than unofficially. Now it was. She and Cecilia had the morning briefings they had always effectively been having, but without the performance of routing things through other channels first. Ray, the groundskeeper who had watched Cecilia redesign the garden in her 5th month and had understood something then that he had not said, continued his work with the gardens. He said to Cecilia, one morning, simply, "The rose came back strong this year." She had smiled and said, "It knew what kind of soil it was in." The kitchen crew stayed, the security rotation stayed, the estate ran the way it had always run because Cecilia had always run it, but now with the clarity of honesty underneath everything. Bridget stayed for 2 weeks after the birth. She worked remotely from the estate's library, which had good light and strong Wi-Fi that Cecilia had upgraded in her 4th month because the original router was inadequate for a house with this many operational needs. At dinner one evening, Bridget looked across the table at Cecilia and said, "You know what strikes me?" "What?" "You're not different. You're exactly the same. You just got the paperwork to match." Cecilia considered this. "That's not entirely true," she said. "I know things now I didn't know before, about how much I was willing to absorb, about what I let happen because I was waiting for someone else to stop it. And I'm not doing that anymore." Preston and Cecilia navigated something in the weeks after the birth that was the hardest conversation they had ever attempted. Not a single conversation. A series of them, on different evenings in different rooms with cups of coffee that went cold while they talked. They circled around the truth and then came closer to it, and then sometimes retreated, and then came closer again. He told her things she had suspected. He told her things she had not known. She told him what the 14 months had felt like from inside her experience of them. She told him about the moments she had felt most invisible, most dismissed, most reduced. She told him this without anger, because the anger had already moved through her and out the other side, and what remained was something more useful. Clarity, precision, the desire to say true things and be heard saying them. He listened. This was the most important thing. For the first time since she had known him, he listened without preparing his defense. What their marriage became from that point forward, neither of them knew with certainty. What it could not go back to being, they both understood this now, with the kind of understanding that does not need to be argued because it has already settled into fact. Annalise Burrow moved out of the guest cottage on the last day of the month. She sent Cecilia a brief, professional note thanking her for the 3 weeks' notice and wishing her and the baby well. She did not mention Preston. Cecilia appreciated the restraint, the folder of text messages and financial records that Annalise had provided sat with Fletcher, in a file that might, or might not, become relevant depending on how several things developed. Fletcher had reviewed them and said, carefully, that they documented a pattern of misrepresentation that extended beyond the estate situation into Preston's business dealings. Cecilia filed this information and did not act on it immediately. She was not in a hurry. She had learned from the best possible teacher that patience was not passive. Patience was a form of power. She was in the kitchen at midnight when she understood this completely. The baby's schedule had reordered time. 4 in the morning was feeding. 2 in the morning was sometimes feeding. Midnight was sometimes just the hour when the house was quiet and Cecilia's mind was running, and she came downstairs because the kitchen was warm and she had always thought better in kitchens. She was making tea. Not any tea. Greta's tea. Dried lavender, a specific proportion of honey, water at a temperature just below boiling. Greta had kept this recipe in a small notebook with a blue cover that Cecilia had found among her things and that Cecilia had memorized after reading it twice. She stood at the stove and she thought about what it meant to stand in a kitchen that was yours, not as a destination, not as a reward, just as a fact. This is the kitchen. It is yours. You have always been here. You have always been capable of being here. The documentation simply caught up. She poured her tea into the mug she had brought from Greta's house. White porcelain with a small chip on the handle that Greta had never bothered to replace, because the tea tasted the same from a chipped mug as from a perfect one, and she had had more important things to spend her attention on. Cecilia stood at the kitchen window with her tea and looked out at the grounds. Dark at midnight, just the path lights through the formal garden, the glow from the edge of the pond. I have never been weak, she thought. I was waiting for the right moment to be visible. She went to the garden. She knew she should sleep. Dr. Crane had been very clear about sleep and recovery. She would go back upstairs in a few minutes. Just a moment first. She opened the rear door. The night was cold now, true November, and she had her robe and her wool cardigan over it, the practical layers of a person who had stopped worrying about what things looked like in favor of whether they kept her warm. She held her tea in both hands. The garden was dormant, the lavender cut back for winter, the bare stems patient in the cold. The climbing rose on the east wall had surprised her with 3 late blooms she had found 2 weeks ago, small and stubborn in the November chill, pale pink and certain of themselves. She sat on the stone bench. She was wearing, under her robe, the house dress she had found in Greta's storage boxes. She wore it sometimes, just here, just in this spot. It had the particular quality of old clothing worn by someone who had moved through her life with purpose. It fit Cecilia like a hand-me-down should fit, a little loosely, generously. She held her tea. She looked at the rose. The hardest thing, she said to the garden, to Greta, who was everywhere in it, was not the 14 months. It was not knowing what I had, not because I didn't have it, I had it all along, but because I hadn't learned yet to stand in it. The night was very quiet. A slight wind moved the bare lavender stems. I know now, she said. 6 months later, the estate was in early spring. The lavender had come back with unusual force, thick along both borders of the garden path, the color of it in the April light, something between blue and purple, that had no precise name. The climbing rose was preparing a full bloom. Cecilia could see the buds tightly furled along the east wall. In a week, maybe 2, the whole wall would be pink. She was in her sitting room on a Tuesday morning, running the monthly portfolio call for Hargrove Legacy Properties. She had taken over full executive oversight from Fletcher 3 months after the birth. Fletcher remained as legal counsel. He had not argued when she asked to take the chair. He had said, in the voice of a man who had expected this outcome, "It's time." The call covered 3 states and 17 properties, 2 new acquisitions in Maryland that she had evaluated and approved, a conservation easement in rural Virginia that Greta had been planning before she died. Cecilia was completing it. A community development project in the Shenandoah Valley that would provide affordable commercial space for small businesses in a region that had been losing them for 20 years. This last project had not been in Greta's notes. It had been Cecilia's idea. She had looked at the land holdings in the area and thought about what Greta would have done with them, and then thought about what she herself wanted to do with them. And they were, she found, not so different. During the call, baby Greta was on a blanket on the sitting room floor. She was 6 months old. She had discovered that she could move her arms to affect the world around her, and she was working on this discovery with the focused intensity of a scientist. She had a soft toy that made a sound when she squeezed it. She was squeezing it. She was watching what happened. She was squeezing it again. After the call, Cecilia closed her laptop and sat on the floor beside her daughter. Baby Greta looked at her with her wide, serious eyes. She had Greta's jaw and Cecilia's eyes, and some combination of the two of them that had produced an expression of general assessment that her daughter directed at the world as though she were evaluating everything she encountered on criteria she had not yet shared with anyone. "Good meeting?" Cecilia said. Baby Greta squeezed her toy. "I'll take that as yes," Cecilia said. She picked her daughter up. She carried her to the east window. Outside was the formal garden, beginning to bloom, the private pond, silver in the spring light, the guest cottages along the west hedge, 2 of them occupied now by legitimate guests. A landscape architect consulting on the east boundary project, and her partner who worked remotely and enjoyed the quiet. The stone walls built in 1912, 340 acres under an April sky.
This is Marcel.
"This is yours," Cecilia told her daughter. "All of it. Every room, every garden, every load-bearing wall." Greta Hargrove Whitfield looked at the garden with the expression she directed at everything. Serious, interested, assessing. Bridget came for the weekend at the end of April. They sat in the garden on a Saturday afternoon that was warm enough to be outside if you had a good sweater. Baby Greta was on a blanket between them with a selection of toys and the serious business of deciding which one to evaluate first. The lavender was in full bloom. The climbing rose on the east wall had opened completely, a cascade of pale pink that moved slightly in the breeze. Bridget said, "Can I ask you something?" "Yes." "Do you think about how different it could have been? If Greta had just told you, if you'd known from the beginning what you had?" Cecilia looked at the garden, at the lavender Greta had grown in Virginia and that she had planted here, at the rose, at her daughter on the blanket, squeezing her toy, watching what happened. "She did tell me," Cecilia said. Bridget looked at her. "Every day of my life, she told me. She used a different language, but she told me." Cecilia paused. "She told me through how she lived, through what she built, through the way she sat across the table from me and never once treated me like someone who needed to be protected from the truth of what she was. I just wasn't ready to hear it until I needed to." Bridget was quiet for a moment. "That might be," she said finally, "the most Greta thing I've ever heard." "Yes," Cecilia said. "I think so too." The baby reached up and closed her small fist around a stalk of lavender that was bending in the breeze within reach. She held it. She looked at it. She looked at Cecilia. She looked back at the lavender. "Careful," Cecilia said gently. "That's yours too. You don't have to grab it." She lifted the baby into her arms and held her in the April warmth and looked at the garden her grandmother had prepared for her without knowing it, that she had planted without fully knowing why, that her daughter was now reaching for with the confident certainty of someone who had always known, on some level she could not yet articulate, that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. On a Monday morning, in early May, Cecilia walked through the foyer of Whitfield Estate in the gold light of a warm morning, baby Greta in the carrier against her chest, the house quiet around them. She paused at the tall gilt mirror by the east entrance. She looked at herself, a woman in a good cardigan and small pearl earrings and sensible shoes, holding her daughter, standing in the foyer of her house in the morning light. The woman in the mirror was not who anyone had expected her to be. She was not who she had expected herself to be 14 months ago, when she had stood in this foyer with her grocery bags in both hands and heard a voice through a 2-inch gap in a door. She had been standing on solid ground even then. She had just needed time to feel it. She went to the kitchen to make coffee. She made it the way Greta had taught her, the specific grind, the exact ratio, the patience to let it bloom fully before pouring. Some things could not be rushed. Some foundations took a lifetime to build and a lifetime to understand, and then, if you were fortunate, a lifetime to pass on. She poured her coffee. She stood at the kitchen window. Outside, the grounds were bright and awake in the May morning. 340 acres, the formal garden, the private pond, the stone walls built by people who had not imagined who would be standing here in this light in this year with this coffee in her hands and this daughter against her chest and this particular knowledge of what it meant to be home. She was home. She had always been home. She just knew it now. Editorial disclaimer: the content in this story, every scene, every character, every emotional beat, was researched, developed, and manually crafted by our editorial team with care and intention. Our goal is not simply to entertain. It is to offer something that stays with you. A reflection, a reminder, a story that means something when it is over. We believe the stories we tell shape how we see ourselves and each other. We take that seriously. Thank you for trusting us with your time.